Alright everyone, I have broken down the metabolism regulatory lecture into 3 parts. The first part is just more of an overview of the metabolism and the different hormones. The second part is going to talk about the thyroid and thyroid disorders. And the third part is going to talk about diabetes. Here are the 3 chapters from your patho book and the corresponding page numbers that we are going to cover in the total of today's lectures. So as with most concepts, the one particular concept, or metabolism regulatory in this case, is going to affect a lot of other concepts. I give you an example of some of them. This is not an exhaustive list. But for example, the metabolism and regulatory can affect oxygenation because it can cause an accumulation of fluid in the abdominal cavity, and this will impair the ability of the lungs to expand, and then you're going to have poor ventilation. Perfusion. If hypothyroid remains untreated, it results in fluid retention, edema, bradycardia, cardiac collapse. So this is just to get you started thinking, our body works as a whole system. Each of the concepts does not work alone. It impacts all the other concepts. Talk about is metabolism. Metabolism is a biochemical reaction after ingestion, digestion, absorption, and transport of nutrients and oxygen. And what it does is it produces energy, it allows for cellular repair, and it is important for life functions and life maintenance. Hormones are what control metabolism, and they do this through chemical messengers to regulate growth, reproduction, fluid and electrolyte balance, gender differentiation, and metabolism. For this unit, our exemplars are going to be diabetes mellitus and the thyroid dysfunctions such as hypo and hyperthyroidism. Some factors that may alter metabolism are things like the function of the endocrine organ. Environmental factors can initiate various hormones to be released in response to a stimuli, so things like temperature changes and temperature regulation through vasoconstriction and sweating. The availability of food sources, right? When food sources become scarce, the body responds by going into starvation mode. The reason it does this is to provide key nutrients to the essential functions, and then it breaks down body fat to ensure there's an energy source. The endocrine system plays a very important role in growth, sex differentiation, metabolism, and adapting to the environment. The endocrine system works alongside of the nervous system to regulate the different body functions. So hormones are the chemical messengers that the body uses to control the flow of information between the tissue and organs. They're released from glands, and you see in the picture here, you have the pineal gland, the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, the thyroid gland, the thymus, the pancreas, the adrenals, and then in males you have testes and the women have ovaries. The kidneys also produce erythropoietin. There's also cells in the heart that make atrial natriuretic factor, and the GI tract makes hormones as well. Now we're going to talk a little bit about hormones. Sometimes a single hormone may have various effects in different tissues, and your text gives a really good example of this. Estradiol, which is an estrogen, has different effects on different tissues. For example, It promotes maturation in the ovarian follicles, but it also maintains skeletal integrity in the bones, two very different actions from the same hormone. But sometimes it takes several hormones to achieve just one single function. So a function such as lipolysis, or releasing the free fatty acids from adipose tissue, actually takes several hormones to achieve. Some of the effects of hormones could be regulating water and acid-base balance, responding to adverse conditions, so things like infection, trauma, stress, growth and development, and digesting, using, and storing nutrients. In your patho book, table 31.1 is a very good reference for the actions of all the hormones if you're a little rusty on them. As you can see in this slide, some hormones have to enter the bloodstream and travel to a distant target cell in order to produce its effect. However, some hormones never need to enter the bloodstream. These are termed either paracrine or autocrine. So if you see here in B, this is paracrine. They act locally on nearby target cells. Versus autocrine, in number C, or letter C, they act right in the cell that produces them. So paracrine, they do have to go to a target cell, but it's really close by. It doesn't have to enter the blood circulation. Autocrine, it works right inside of the cell that produces it. And this is versus A up here, where they have to go into the bloodstream and travel to a very distant target cell. Hormones are divided into three categories. You have your amines, which are derived from amino acids, and these are things like your epinephrine, your dopamine, and your thyroid hormones, T3 and T4. Then there is peptide hormones, so these include peptide, polypeptide, protein, and glycoprotein hormones. Some examples of these would be your insulin, your glucagon, hypothalamus, and pituitary hormones. And then the third category is your steroid hormones, which are made from cholesterol. And examples of these are cortisol, aldosterone, and testosterone. There are also substances in your body called eicosanoids. These eicosanoids have hormone-like actions, but they are not themselves hormones. They are derived from polyunsaturated fatty acids in the cell membrane, and some examples of these would be your prostaglandins, your leukotrienes, and your thromboxans. Here's a question for you. Is it true or false? Steroid hormones are all derived from cholesterol. And the answer is true. So now let's talk about how hormones are able to transport themselves. And this is talking about the ones that need to go into the bloodstream. And that's exactly it. The hormones are released from the bloodstream, and then they circulate as free hormones, whether they're peptide and protein hormones, or steroid and thyroid hormones have to be attached to a transport carrier. So the hormone's created, it gets to where it needs to go, and now it does eventually have to be inactivated. Otherwise, there would be too much of an accumulation of them. So if they're peptide hormones, they are destroyed by enzymes at the receptor site, and then they're excreted by the kidneys and liver. Your steroid hormones in your T3 and T4 are inactive when they are bound to that protein carrier. Once unbound, they're destroyed in the liver and excreted in bile. So hormone receptors is like your lock and key, right? So hormones produce their effect by interacting with a particular receptor. Sorry, my mind was still on carriers. These particular receptors recognize a specific hormone. So let's say the hormone is T3. There are specific receptors where only T3 can attach to it and then produce the desired effect. The hormones bind to the cell membrane or intracellular receptors. Only cells with receptors for the hormone will respond. And then response depends on receptor number and affinity. So there's a term called upregulation, where cells are going to make more receptors in response to decreased hormone levels, versus downregulation, where cells are going to make fewer receptors when there is excess hormone levels. And here's another question for you. Your patient has low levels of circulating thyroid hormone. How will the cells of the thyroid gland respond? Will they A, give no response, B, response will depend upon the levels of TCH, C, downregulation, or D, upregulation? All right, let's see. The answer is D, upregulation. Right, so again, when there's that diminished hormone activity, the cells are going to make more hormone receptors, and then this is going to increase that amount of hormone. So now we're going to jump into talking a little bit about hypothalamic pituitary regulation. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland together form a unit that controls several endocrine glands. The hypothalamus detects the state of the body. So it detects things like temperature, blood osmolarity, blood nutrients, hormone levels, inflammatory mediators, emotions, and pain. So this is just an example of their feedback mechanism, right? So the CNS gives some input to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is going to release a hormone that's going to travel to the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is going to release a hormone, and that hormone will go to the target gland. The target gland will secrete a hormone. It'll go to the target cell, and then you have the physiologic effect. And then when there's the appropriate amount of hormone circulating through the body, it sends a message back up to the hypothalamus that the secretion of all these other hormones do not need to be done. So it's kind of like a chain reaction. So the hormones that the hypothalamus produce are going to be synthesized in the hypothalamus and then travel to the posterior pituitary. Right? The posterior pituitary hormones are going to be your ADHD and your oxytocin. And then there's hypothalamic hormones that regulate secretion of the anterior pituitary hormones. So this is going to be your GH-releasing hormone, somatostatin, dopamine, TRH, CRH, and gonadotropin-releasing hormone. So basically, again, the hypothalamic hormones are going to go either to the posterior pituitary or they're going to go to the anterior pituitary, and they are going to stimulate the pituitary to release another hormone. So just to recap, the hypothalamus releases neurohormones. These are going to enter portal circulation, travel to the anterior pituitary endocrine cells with receptors. And then the anterior pituitary releases hormones that are going to enter systemic circulation and then travel to cells with receptors for those hormones. The pituitary gland is a pea-sized endocrine gland, and it is located at the base of the brain. They call it the master gland because its hormones control the function of many target glands and cells. And it has two functional units, the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe. The anterior lobe produces ACTH, gonadotropins, which are your LH or luteinizing hormone, and your follicle stimulating hormone or FSH, and then your GH and your prolactin. The posterior lobe stores and releases ADH and oxytocin. So basically, the ACTH that the pituitary releases stimulates the adrenal cortex to produce cortisol. TSH stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormones. GH stimulates the liver to produce IGF-I. FSH and LH stimulate the gonads to create sex hormones. And prolactin stimulates the breast to make milk production. So a lot of the hormones are regulated by this negative feedback system I talked about, right? So sensors are going to detect a change in hormone level and then adjust secretion to make the levels normal. So if a sensor is going to detect too much of a hormone, it will decrease production, and vice versa. If it senses too little of a hormone, it's going to increase production. Your book basically compares it to a thermostat, right? If you have your thermostat your thermostat set to 70. If it reaches 75, it's going to shut off the heat. If it drops down to 65, it's going to turn on and increase the heat to get it back to that stable temperature. There are several different tests to measure hormone function. They may indirectly measure the function by measuring the effects of the hormone on body. So, for example, measuring blood glucose, right? Glucose is not a hormone, but by measuring blood glucose, you're indirectly measuring insulin levels, and insulin is a hormone. So, blood tests, these are going to measure levels at a specific time. Urine tests are used to measure hormones or hormone metabolites. Stimulation tests look at hypofunction, where suppression tests look at hyperfunction. Then there's various genetic tests and imaging studies. So they can do isotopic imaging, MRI, CT, ultrasound, PET scan, and DEXA. Right? So doing the imaging is going to look at the function of these different endocrine structures. Disorders of the endocrine system are going to have various effects depending on the disorder. They may affect growth and development, energy metabolism, muscle and adipose tissue distribution, sexual development, fluid and electrolyte imbalance, and then different inflammatory and immune responses. The prevalence and incidence of these various disorders is going to depend on the metabolic disorder. So here's three of the main ones, right? So diabetes, an incidence of diabetes is 1.5 million cases per year. According to the CDC in 2015, 30.3 million people in the U.S. have diabetes. This is 9.4% of the population. 1.25 million people have type 1. So the remainder of those are type 2. For ethnicity, 7.4% of non-Hispanic whites have diabetes, 8% of Asian Americans, 12.1% of Hispanics, 12.7% of non-Hispanic blacks, and then the highest incidence is 14.9% of men and 15.3% of women of Native American or Alaskan Native heritage. I actually have one of my students in my PhD cohort who is a Native. She's Ho Chunk. She is devoting all of her time and research on diabetes in the Native community. So there's a lot being done to help with this, but not enough. So obesity, I know we are not directly covering obesity, but it is important to know the prevalence of obesity because it's one of the risk factors for type 2 diabetes. So 38.8% of adults, which is 93 million people, and 20.6% of youth ages 12 to 19, plus 17.4% of children 6 to 11, and 13.9% of children 2 to 5 in the U.S. are obese, and this is based on 2017. So it's quite a large chunk of the population. Overall, women are going to have higher rates of obesity than men among non-Hispanic Black, non-Hispanic Asian, and Hispanic adults. Obesity is higher in adults ages 40 to 59, followed by 20 to 39, and the lowest is in ages 2 to 5. The overall trend of obesity is rising from 30.5 to 39.6% since 1999 for adults, and just in the last year alone, it's gone up 1.9%. There's a rise in children obesity or childhood obesity as well, whereas it used to be 13.9%, it's now 18.5%, and that was a 1.3% increase just in this last year alone. And then the thyroid disorder, there's really no specifics on incidence of prevalence of thyroid disorder. It's not one really that people are tracking for whatever reason. So here's your risk factors. Genetics, environment, and lifestyle are all going to play a role in the development of various metabolic disorders. Right? Clients with these disorders in general have a genetic predisposition. And then there's the environmental triggers that play a role, so things like infection or exposure to different environmental toxins. Lifestyle also plays a role, so again, here's obesity or weight gain. Lack of iodine in food sources, we'll talk about that when we talk about thyroid disorders and different things like that. So prevention is going to be key. And when we talk about type 1 diabetes, there really isn't primary prevention strategies. However, for type 2 diabetes, it's all going to be related to those lifestyle changes or modifications. So things like diet and exercise are going to be important for management of both types of diabetes and obesity. Right? So again, for type 1, it's not going to prevent it, but it still will help with the management of type 1 diabetes. Secondary prevention relates to preventing or delaying complications of diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2, and that's going to be done by looking at the diagnostic test. So basically, when you think of secondary prevention, you're thinking screenings and diagnostic tests. So tests like your fasting plasma glucose and your hemoglobin A1C are going to be used to diagnose and manage type 1 and type 2 diabetes. The BMI aids in the diagnosis of obesity. It's also an indicator of a risk factor for type 2 diabetes. Serum electrolytes can supplement the diagnosis and complication of any of the disorders. And then there's your thyroid function test. So your TSH, your T3, your T4, all of these are going to help determine whether or not there is thyroid disease present. Basically, endocrine disorders occur either because of hypofunction or hyperfunction. And some different causes of hypofunction are going to be congenital defects, destruction of the gland, aging, certain drug therapy can cause atrophy of the gland, receptor defects, and then there's unknown reasons. Hyperfunction can be caused by excessive hormone production, so from overstimulation or hyperplasia of the gland, from tumors, or from taking exogenous hormones and taking too much of it. And the final concept for this section is going to be primary, secondary, and tertiary hormone disorders. So your primary disorders are going to originate in the target gland responsible for producing that hormone. Secondary, the target gland is normal. It is the function altered by defecting levels of stimulating hormone or releasing hormone from the pituitary that's the problem. And then tertiary, the abnormality is in the hypothalamus, so both the target gland and the pituitary gland are understimulated. So an example, right, having your thyroid removed, that's going to be a primary deficiency, right? That target gland responsible for producing your thyroid hormones is destroyed. An example of removal of the pituitary gland as a secondary. So, right, your thyroid hormones are still produced in the thyroid if they had the pituitary gland stimulate them, right? So the problem now is secondary. It's because the pituitary gland does not secrete thyroid stimulating hormone. And an example of tertiary would be something like cancer that would destroy both the target gland and the pituitary gland. All right, so this is the end of just the basic overview of the endocrine regulatory system. The next section, we are going to talk about thyroid disorders.